Hey guys, tonight we're settling in with one of those topics that feels a little grim at first, but don't worry, it's the kind of history that's so strange, so awkwardly human, that it just turns oddly relaxing when you lay it out slowly. So grab your blanket, turn down the brightness, maybe let your tea go lukewarm, and let's wander through the weirdly ceremonial afterlives of kings. Because here's the thing. When normal people died in the past, the process was usually straightforward. You got washed, wrapped, buried, maybe sung over, and that was that. But kings? Well, when you're a medieval or early modern ruler, you don't just die. You get processed, staged, occasionally boiled, yes, boiled, and then turned into a sort of public spectacle. Sometimes it went smoothly, sometimes it went very, very badly. So tonight we're just floating through history's collection of royal corpses and their journeys from throne room to tomb. And it's less horror story and more bureaucratic comedy. Because the lengths people went to preserve, parade, and sometimes literally patch together kings is just endlessly odd. Let's start with the basics. Embalming. Now, embalming wasn't some universal automatic royal practice. Some dynasties loved it. Others thought it was a bit much. In the early Middle Ages, a lot of rulers didn't bother. If you died, you got stuck in a stone coffin, sometimes with lime poured on you, sometimes with a few relics tossed in, and you were left to return to dust. But as kingdoms got richer and funerals turned into PR events, embalming started creeping in, because no one wanted their grand monarch to smell like what actually happens to bodies after death. The English kings were especially into this. William the Conqueror, for example, had the most embarrassing royal funeral probably ever recorded. He died in 1087 in France, which was inconvenient, because he was supposed to be buried in Caen. The problem was, William had gotten very, very large in his later years, like he was not fitting into the average coffin. His corpse bloated, as corpses do, and by the time they wedged him into his stone sarcophagus, the whole thing literally exploded during the funeral service. In the middle of the church, in front of everybody. Imagine the solemn hymns, the incense, and then the coffin lid can't handle the pressure, and suddenly the king himself is, let's say, not resting in peace. That little disaster kind of set the tone for why embalming became more fashionable, because nobody wanted a repeat of King Boom. So by the time we get into the later Middle Ages, English and French monarchs are getting their insides scooped out, salted and perfumed, which sounds gross, but was really just the deluxe package of the time. It let the body last long enough for processions, funerals, and sometimes weeks of lying in state. Because if you're a king, people need to look at you one last time, even if it's mostly wax and flowers holding you together. But here's where things get really weird. Sometimes the bodies of kings were actually separated. Yes, divided up, like a medieval 3-for-1 deal. You might have the heart buried in one place, the body in another, and maybe even the entrails somewhere else entirely. Why? Mostly logistics. If you died far away from home, the quickest way to make your corpse transportable was to remove the organs, because those start the decomposition party right away. The rest of the body could then be packed in spices, sealed in a coffin, and shipped off like a very unfortunate cargo. Richard the Lionheart is one of the more famous examples. He died in 1199 from an arrow wound in France. His heart was removed, embalmed, and buried in Rouen Cathedral, because that was a symbolic city of his power. His body went to Fontevraud Abbey, and his entrails. Those were buried near the spot where he died, probably because no one wanted to cart them around. Imagine being a pilgrim centuries later, walking into some little French church, and learning you're kneeling over Richard the Lionheart's intestines. Very spiritual. This heart-body entrails split was surprisingly common. It became a sort of dynastic fashion. Monarchs of Spain, Hungary, and the Habsburg Empire in particular loved separating themselves like souvenir sets. The Habsburgs had this whole system in Vienna, where the body went to the imperial crypt. The heart was placed in a silver urn in the Augustinian church, and the intestines went to St. Stephen's Cathedral. It was like a royal scavenger hunt across the city. And yes, you can still visit all three spots today, which is a strange kind of sightseeing. Oh, here's where Franz Joseph's kidneys are resting. Now, if you're thinking, wow, medieval funeral workers had a rough job, you'd be absolutely right. Some of them literally had to boil kings. This is not an exaggeration. If a monarch died far from home, and they wanted to preserve the bones for transport, one method was called mos teutonicus, the German custom. Essentially, they stripped the flesh from the bones by simmering the body in water or wine until only the skeleton was left. The bones were then cleaned, perfumed, and placed in a chest, while the soft tissue was buried locally. Louis IX of France, later Saint Louis, got this treatment when he died on crusade in 1270. His body was boiled down, bones shipped back to France and distributed as relics. His soft tissue stayed in Tunisia. So technically, parts of St. Louis are in North Africa forever, while his bones got the royal Paris treatment. It's not exactly restful, but it made sense in the logistics of the time. And it also let rulers have more than one shrine, which was useful for politics. More relics meant more pilgrimages, more money, more prestige. Even in death, the king was still earning revenue. Let's drift for a moment to what happened after burial. You might imagine kings stayed quietly in their tombs, but no. Kings' bodies often got disturbed, sometimes centuries later. Tombs were opened for repairs, or to move the dynasty's crypt, or, let's be honest, out of sheer curiosity. When French revolutionaries stormed Saint-Denis in 1793, they opened up centuries' worth of royal tombs, dragged out the bodies, and tossed them in mass graves. Reports say Henry Fawkes' body was still oddly well preserved, beard and all, which is either impressive embalming or a sign that medieval barbers were onto something with all that rosemary and wine preservation. Meanwhile, in England, Oliver Cromwell had Charles III executed in 1649. Charles was buried quickly, somewhat quietly, but when the monarchy was restored, Charles became a martyr. His tomb was opened later in the 19th century, and witnesses wrote about his intact head of hair and even the recognizable shape of his nose. Not bad for a king who lost his head, but we'll come back to exhumations later. For now, let's ease into some of the little ceremonial quirks of royal funerals. One of the strangest was the practice of displaying effigies. In the late Middle Ages and Renaissance, if a king's body wasn't exactly camera-ready, too bloated, too decayed, they'd have a wax figure made of him instead. This wax effigy, dressed in royal robes, was laid out on the bier or displayed on the coffin, so people could come pay respects without being traumatized. Sometimes the effigy looked nothing like the actual king, but hey, it was about the idea of monarchy, not the accuracy. Henry VII of England had one of these. His embalmed body wasn't in great shape, so the wax version stood in at his funeral. It looked so good, in fact, that some effigies ended up on display in Westminster Abbey for centuries. People would visit them almost like wax museums, except instead of Madame Tussauds celebrities, you had long-dead Tudors. So to sum up where we are so far, the short answer to what happened to kings' bodies after they died is a lot. They were embalmed, boiled, divided, paraded, waxed, and sometimes accidentally exploded. And we're just getting started. In the next stretch, we'll drift into some specific royal disasters, like the body of Philip the Fair, who lived up to exactly none of his name in death, or the time Charles II of Spain's corpse became a national embarrassment. And we'll float through how royalty used funerals as power plays, because nothing says dynasty like outshining your rival with a shinier coffin. But for now, just keep sinking into the rhythm. Kings didn't just rule strangely. They also decompose strangely, and somehow that makes their stories all the more human. Corpse disasters, royal meltdowns, and funeral flexing all right. Let's float a little further down this candlelit hallway of royal funerals. We've already seen William the Conqueror going kaboom, Richard the Lionheart being distributed like a 3-part souvenir set, and the Habsburgs running a whole collect-them-all system with hearts and guts. But really, those were just the warm-up acts, because once you start paying attention, the history of kings' corpses is basically a series of awkward moments strung together. It's like a sitcom, except the cast is embalmed, and the laugh track is monks chanting, "Take Philip the Fair of France." His name promised us something majestic, the fair meaning handsome and noble. But when he died in 1314 after a hunting accident, the aftermath was anything but dignified. His embalming didn't exactly go well, and by the time his body was paraded through Paris, witnesses noted that the smell was overpowering. Not just a little musty, but bad enough that the procession became uncomfortable. Nothing like a decomposing king to dampen national mourning. People wanted to honor their monarch, but they also wanted to breathe. This was a recurring theme, actually. The fancier the funeral, the longer the procession, the higher the chance that the body would make its presence known. The Middle Ages were not known for refrigeration, after all. So even with embalming, there was only so much you could do when your king died in July. And then there's Charles II of Spain, better known as the Bewitched. You might remember him as the tragic Habsburg king, who was so genetically inbred he could barely chew food properly, let alone rule an empire. His death in 1700 was not a shock. Everyone had seen it coming for years. But his funeral still managed to be one of the most humiliating royal send-offs in history. The embalming was poorly done, or maybe just not done at all. Accounts say that when the coffin was opened during the funeral rites, the body had already decomposed to the point of horror. One report describes his face as black as ink, with his features unrecognizable. Another says the stench was so overwhelming that courtiers fainted in the chapel. So the most powerful dynasty in Europe ended up looking like amateurs at the one thing they should have nailed, making a king look good one last time. Now, Charles II's case also reminds us of something important. Royal funerals weren't just funerals. They were propaganda. Every detail was supposed to broadcast power, stability, and glory. The banners, the music, the sermons, all carefully scripted. Even the corpse itself was part of the show. The king lying in state was supposed to embody dignity and order, which is why a blackened, smelly disaster of a corpse was such a political problem. It suggested weakness, decay, even divine disfavor. So yes, imagine your dynasty's legitimacy wobbling because your embalmer messed up the spices. On the other end of the spectrum, some monarchs were so perfectly embalmed that their corpses became tourist attractions. Let's drift over to Henry IV of France. When his tomb was opened during the French Revolution, people were shocked at how well preserved he was. His beard was intact, his facial features recognizable, his body almost lifelike. Revolutionaries, who were supposed to be dumping kings into pits, couldn't help admiring him. They even lifted his head out for people to gawk at. It's not exactly the afterlife Henry probably envisioned. But hey, still commanding attention 2 centuries later is kind of impressive. And then there was Ferdinand III of Castile, a sainted king of Spain. When his tomb was opened centuries later, his body was reported to be incorrupt, meaning it hadn't decayed. For medieval people, this was a sure sign of holiness. For modern historians, it was probably just good embalming and a dry tomb. Still, pilgrims flocked to see him, and Ferdinand's corpse became almost as important politically as his reign, because nothing says God loves this dynasty like a king who refuses to rot. Let's shift for a moment to England again. English monarchs had their own share of corpse drama. When Edward I, nicknamed Longshanks, died in 1307, his body was embalmed and carried slowly back to London. The trip took months, with the king lying in state at various abbeys along the way. It was a travelling funeral roadshow, basically. When he was finally entombed at Westminster, his coffin was sealed tightly in lead. Centuries later, when antiquarians peeked inside, they found him still fairly intact, his tall frame stretched out in royal robes. For a man known as a fearsome warrior king, staying intimidating even in death was very on brand. Compare that with Edward IV, who died in 1483. His body swelled up so much during the funeral preparations that the coffin barely closed. Reports mention liquid seeping out, always a great look for a royal procession. Again, embalming techniques could only do so much. Too hot, too humid, or too rushed, and suddenly the king was giving off more than just majesty. And speaking of swelling, one of the saddest but also strangest stories belongs to Pope Formosus. Okay, technically not a king, but popes were basically monarchs of Rome. After he died in 896, his corpse wasn't left in peace. His successor had him dug up months later, dressed in papal robes, and put on trial in the infamous Cadaver Synod. They literally sat his decaying body in a chair, questioned him, and declared him guilty. Then they tossed him into the Tiber River. It's not exactly a royal funeral, but it shows just how political dead bodies could be. They weren't just corpses. They were tools in the living's power games. That political side explains why so many monarchs had these elaborate multi-stage burials. The funeral wasn't just a goodbye. It was a baton pass, a chance for the new ruler to stand there, look solemn and remind everyone, don't worry, I've got this. Which is why so much attention went into coffins, effigies, and choreographed mourning. Sometimes the dead king was almost less important than the living one standing next to the coffin. But every so often, the dead king stole the show anyway. Let's float back to Louis XIV of France, the Sun King. He had ruled for over 70 years, which is exhausting just to say out loud. When he died in 1715, the embalming was thorough. But the real drama came during his lying in state. His body was displayed in an open coffin, richly dressed, surrounded by candles. Crowds filed through to see him one last time. It was so crowded that pickpockets actually worked the funeral, stealing from mourners as they shuffled by. Imagine attending the Sun King's final bow and going home without your wallet. Truly, a man who generated taxes even in death. And then, after Louis, the French royal funeral tradition really fell apart. His great-grandson, Louis XV, died in 1774 of smallpox, and the body was in such bad shape that no one wanted it near Paris. His funeral was rushed, barely attended, and whispers spread that even the clergy weren't sad to see him go. That contrast between the glorious send-off of Louis XIV and the pathetic burial of Louis V showed exactly how far the monarchy's prestige had declined. By the time of Louis XVI, of course, there wasn't even a royal funeral. Just a guillotine, a quick burial, and later a revolution. Meanwhile, over in Russia, the Tsars had their own brand of awkward funerals. Peter the Great, for example, died in 1725. His embalming was apparently botched because his body blackened quickly, but that didn't stop them from displaying him in state for weeks. People filed past, some weeping, some probably holding their noses. Centuries later, the Romanovs also suffered from political corpse drama. After the Bolsheviks executed Nicholas II and his family in 1918, their bodies were hidden, moved, burned, and buried secretly. For decades, the location of their remains was a mystery. Only in the late 20th century were they rediscovered and reburied in St. Petersburg. Even then, DNA tests, arguments, and disputes kept dragging on. Royal bodies, it seems, just can't stay quietly underground. And maybe that's the real thread through all of this. Kings weren't just men. Their bodies weren't just flesh. They were symbols. A living king represented order and divine favor. A dead king, if treated properly, could still symbolize continuity, stability, and tradition. But if the corpse went wrong, if it stank, collapsed, or got tossed in a ditch, it symbolized weakness, corruption, or failure, which is why so much energy went into trying to control the uncontrollable, decay. But the truth is, no matter how many spices, how much lead, or how elaborate the coffin, kings rotted like everyone else. Sometimes slower, sometimes with more perfume, but always eventually. Which makes their elaborate post-mortem journeys feel both absurd and touching. These were people who ruled empires, who commanded armies, who were worshipped as chosen by God, and in the end, they were just bodies needing to be boxed up, cleaned up, and hopefully not exploding at the funeral. So, let's float gently into the next stretch, where we'll look at even stranger cases. Kings who were mummified, kings who were reburied multiple times, and those poor monarchs whose tombs became tourist attractions. Because nothing says eternal glory like centuries of visitors poking at your coffin. Mummies, reburials, and tomb tourism. So, let's drift a little further into this crypt of royal afterlives. We've watched kings explode, melt, get boiled, get divided, and sometimes miraculously not rot at all. But there's an even stranger category to wander into tonight. The kings who ended up as mummies, the kings who just couldn't stay buried, and the kings who, whether they liked it or not, became tourist attractions. Because if you thought ruling an empire was exhausting, try being dead for 500 years while strangers keep opening your coffin just to gawk at you. Let's start with the mummified monarchs. Now when we hear royal mummy, our minds jump straight to Egypt. And fair enough. Pharaohs perfected the art of drying out kings and wrapping them up for eternity. But what's less well known is that medieval and early modern European royals sometimes ended up with accidental mummification too. Not the fancy linen-wrapped kind, but the natural oops, the crypt was so dry it just preserved the body kind. Take Christian the Rye of Denmark, for instance. He died in 1481 and was buried in Roskilde Cathedral. When his coffin was opened centuries later, his body was found to be in a surprisingly mummified state. Skin, hair, even clothing had survived the centuries. And, of course, word spread quickly, because nothing draws a crowd like a royal mummy suddenly available for viewing. Or Charles the Fiend of Sweden, the so-called warrior king. He died in 1718, shot in the head during a siege. His body was embalmed and interred in Stockholm, but when his tomb was opened later, his corpse was still in such good condition that people could clearly see the bullet hole in his skull. His death had always been controversial. Was he assassinated by his own men or killed by the enemy? So naturally, his very corpse became evidence in the debate. Imagine being so unlucky that not even death spares you from office gossip. But probably the most famous mummified monarch in Europe is Frederick William III of Prussia, the so-called Soldier King. He died in 1740, and when his tomb was opened during World War II, his body was still remarkably preserved. Nazi officials, never ones to miss a propaganda opportunity, even displayed him briefly. Which raises the unsettling thought. Imagine being dug up 200 years later, only to become a Nazi museum piece. The afterlife doesn't get much more awkward than that, but accidental mummies weren't always respected. During the French Revolution, for example, when mobs opened the tombs at Saint-Denis, many royal bodies that had been embalmed or naturally preserved were dragged out and desecrated. Some were displayed, some were dumped in mass graves. It wasn't about science, it was about humiliating the monarchy one last time. Even death, apparently, couldn't save you from bad PR. Now let's drift over to the other category: kings who couldn't stay buried. Reburials were surprisingly common. Sometimes it was politics, new dynasties moving old rulers to make a point. Sometimes it was logistics, repairing churches or crypts. And sometimes it was sheer curiosity. One of the most famous reburials in recent memory is Richard III of England. He died in 1485 at the Battle of Bosworth, ending both his life and the Plantagenet dynasty. His body was buried quickly in a Leicester church, basically a hasty job for a defeated king. And then, centuries later, in 2012, his skeleton was rediscovered under, of all things, a modern parking lot. Talk about undignified. The last king of the Middle Ages, lying under asphalt with cars rolling over him daily. When his remains were confirmed by DNA, the debate began. Where should Richard be reburied? York wanted him because he was a Yorkist king. Leicester wanted to keep him because they had literally found him. In the end, Leicester Cathedral got him. And in 2015, Richard III received a grand reburial, complete with modern ceremonial pomp. It was probably the nicest funeral he ever had, half a millennium late, but still. So if you ever feel like you've been overlooked in life, just remember, sometimes you get your proper recognition 500 years after the fact. And then there's King Canute the Great, the Viking who became King of England, Denmark, and Norway. He died in 1035 and was buried at Winchester. But during the English Civil War in the 1600s, his tomb was vandalized by parliamentary soldiers. His bones were scattered, mixed with others, and hastily recollected later. Today, his remains rest in a mortuary chest with other royal bones at Winchester Cathedral. So if you go there, you'll see an urn labeled with about 4 different kings' names. It's the royal version of miscellaneous box in the attic. Even St. Edward the Confessor, one of England's most venerated kings, didn't stay put. His body was originally interred in Westminster Abbey in 1066, but when Henry III rebuilt the abbey in the 13th century, Edward's remains were moved into a lavish shrine. During the Reformation, the shrine was dismantled, then later restored, and Edward's bones were put back, hopefully in the right order. At this point, it's less eternal rest and more eternal musical chairs. Sometimes reburials were less about piety and more about revenge. When Oliver Cromwell died in 1658, he was buried with full state honours in Westminster Abbey. But after the monarchy was restored in 1660, Charles II decided he wasn't letting the man who killed his dad rest peacefully. Cromwell's body was dug up, posthumously executed, and his head stuck on a pike outside Westminster Hall. The head stayed on display for decades until it fell off in a storm, got passed around as a collector's item, and eventually ended up buried in Cambridge. So yes, Cromwell had multiple funerals, none of them dignified. And that brings us neatly into the last category, tomb tourism. Because once royal bodies were safely interred, you'd think they'd be left in peace, but no. People have always been fascinated by dead kings, and tombs became attractions long before the age of Instagram. Take Napoleon Bonaparte. Not technically a king, but close enough in ego. He died in exile on St. Helena in 1821, buried quietly under a simple tomb. But when his remains were brought back to France in 1840, it turned into a massive spectacle. His body, still surprisingly intact thanks to the island's soil, was reburied in Les Invalides in Paris, in a giant red sarcophagus designed to humble anyone who looked at it. Today, thousands of tourists shuffle around it every year. Napoleon may not have gotten his empire back, but he definitely secured his status as Paris's most famous corpse, or Peter the Great in Russia. Buried in the Peter and Paul Cathedral in St. Petersburg, his tomb became a must-see for visitors. Travelers in the 18th and 19th centuries would describe being taken to see the Tsar's coffin, as if he were still greeting guests in death. Same with the Romanovs. When their remains were finally reburied in the 1990s, the ceremony was broadcast like a state event, cementing their status as historical icons. And then there are the kings who became literal museum pieces. Ramses II of Egypt was flown to Paris in 1974 for preservation treatment, complete with a passport listing his occupation as king deceased. Crowds lined up to see him, as if he were still a celebrity doing a European tour. The irony is almost too perfect. 3,000 years after death, Ramses was still being treated like royalty, customs, paperwork and all. Even in more modest settings, royal tombs draw fascination. Westminster Abbey, Saint Denis, the Escorial in Spain, the Habsburg Crypt in Vienna. These places became tourist circuits, with visitors peeking at marble coffins, reading epitaphs, and sometimes being told colorful tales about the bodies inside. Because there's always something oddly grounding about seeing where the supposedly immortal rulers ended up, in a box, like the rest of us. And here's the funny thing. For all the pomp, for all the embalming, the parades, the shrines, and the mummification accidents, the fate of kings' bodies ultimately reveals something universal. They were human. They rotted. They got misplaced. They got reburied. They got turned into curiosities. Dynasties rose and fell. Revolutions swept away their symbols. But the corpses themselves, sometimes stubbornly preserved, sometimes embarrassingly messy, always told the truth. Kings were just people. People with better coffins, maybe, but people all the same. So as we dim the lights a little further tonight, let's keep floating with that thought. Royalty spent their lives pretending they were above the ordinary. But in death their bodies betrayed them, just as ordinary, just as fragile, just as temporary. And maybe that's the real comfort of this sleepy journey through royal tombs. Because if even the Sun King ended up as dust, we can probably relax a little about our own small place in history. In the next stretch, we'll drift into the very last oddities, the symbolic burials, the wax effigies that outlasted the real bodies, and the occasional royal heart that somehow ended up in a biscuit tin. Because yes, of course that happened. Boiled bones, rotting kings, and the odd smell of royalty. So, when we last drifted through the medieval mortuary wonderland, we were knee-deep in embalming tricks, half-successful preservation, and the general inability of medieval people to keep a body from turning into soup. Tonight, let's float a little deeper into the stranger afterlife of kings, specifically what happened when they started to, well, we smell, because here's the deal. A king could be buried in a cathedral with golden candlesticks, Latin choirs, and velvet drapery. But none of that really covers the fact that the body inside was still decaying like any other human. And despite their best efforts with spices, wine, or a few desperate stitches, corpses leaked. They bloated. They reeked. Which made royal funerals not exactly the serene moments of mourning you might imagine. Take, for instance, William the Conqueror. Yes, the guy who basically invented Norman England. He died in 1087 after falling off his horse. Not a very majestic end for a man who terrorized the English countryside. His body was carted around in hot summer weather for weeks, while monks bickered about where to bury him. By the time he arrived at Caen for burial, the poor man was so swollen with gas that when they tried to squeeze him into a too-small stone tomb, his abdomen literally burst. In front of everyone. Monks, nobles, priests, all got a whiff of the conqueror's last act. The entire church filled with the smell of rotting flesh and, according to chroniclers, the funeral had to be cut short because nobody could stay inside. Nothing says eternal memory of the king, like people running for fresh air. And William wasn't unique. In fact, exploding royal corpses were kind of a medieval theme. If you didn't embalm correctly, or if the weather got too warm, things went badly. Henry I, William's son, famously died from eating a surfeit of lampreys, basically an overdose of slimy eels. His body had to be carried from Normandy to Reading Abbey in England. Of course, transport took weeks, and embalming wasn't exactly an exact science. Chroniclers delicately note that the body greatly offended the nose. Imagine being one of the poor attendants, stuck walking behind that coffin for hundreds of miles. And let's not forget Philip II of Spain. Now, Philip was a devout Catholic, a micromanager and a collector of black clothes. He also spent the last years of his life covered in ulcers that wouldn't heal. When he finally died in 1598, his body was such a mess that embalming could barely hold him together. Monks reported an overwhelming stench during the final rites, which frankly sounds about right for a man who had micromanaged Europe into bankruptcy. But here's where it gets weirder. Sometimes, to avoid the embarrassment of exploding or leaking bodies, medieval folks developed a very practical solution. Just boiled the king down to bones. Yes, really, this practice was called mos teutonicus, the German custom. Basically, if a king died far from home, and you didn't want to lug a stinking corpse across hundreds of miles, you stripped the body, chopped it into manageable pieces, and boiled the flesh off the bones in a big cauldron of water or wine. The bones, once nice and clean, could then be transported back to a cathedral for burial. Think of it as the medieval version of travel-sized royalty, the most famous example. Louis IX of France, later Saint Louis. He died in 1270 on crusade in North Africa. His followers didn't want to leave his royal body to rot under the Tunisian sun, so they boiled him until only the bones remained, packed them up, and shipped them home to France. Very dignified. Nothing like simmering your king in a pot like a stew, even more awkward. The church eventually banned mos teutonicus, declaring it disrespectful. Which, to be fair, it kind of was. But by then, quite a few royal skeletons had already made the journey by crockpot. And then there's the matter of royal heart burials. Because why stop at bones when you can start distributing organs like holy souvenirs? Many kings and queens had their hearts buried separately, sometimes in a different church, sometimes in a completely different country. Richard the Lionheart, for example, was buried in 3 pieces: body in France, heart in Rouen, and entrails somewhere else entirely. It's like medieval rulers wanted to be frequent flyers even in death, but distributing body parts wasn't always noble or symbolic. Sometimes it was just weird. Anne of Brittany, Queen of France in the late 1400s, had her heart placed in a golden reliquary shaped like a heart. Centuries later, during the French Revolution, the urn was dug up, tossed around by angry mobs, and nearly destroyed before someone realized, oh right, maybe we shouldn't vandalize the Queen's actual organ. So yeah, between exploding corpses, boiled skeletons, and portable hearts, the afterlife of royalty wasn't serene. It was messy, smelly, and often ridiculous, which honestly feels very on brand for monarchy in general. Let's drift onward now, because the saga doesn't end with burials. Oh no, some kings and queens didn't get to rest in peace at all. Their bodies were dug up, paraded, reburied, or even put on trial. Yes, you heard that right, a corpse on trial. But that's a story for the next stretch of our slow midnight wander. Dug up, shuffled around, and occasionally put on trial. So, here's the thing. You'd think once a king was finally lowered into the ground, stuffed with spices, wrapped in silk, and sealed up in a crypt, that would be it. End of story. Eternal rest, right? Well, not quite. Royal bodies had this strange habit of refusing to stay put. Sometimes politics changed. Sometimes religion shifted. Sometimes people just wanted to move things around like an overambitious interior decorator. And occasionally, just occasionally, the dead king himself got dragged into some fresh drama. centuries after he should have been left alone. Let's start with a classic, King Richard III of England. Yes, Shakespeare's favourite hunchback villain. Richard died in 1485 at the Battle of Bosworth, basically face-planting into history as the last Plantagenet king. He was buried quickly in a modest grave at a Leicester friary. And there he stayed. Until Henry VIII dissolved the monasteries, the friary got bulldozed, and Richard's bones were lost under what eventually became a parking lot. Fast forward 500 years. In 2012, archaeologists dig under that same parking lot and, lo and behold, find Richard's skeleton curled up awkwardly in the dirt. Spinal deformity, battle wounds, all of it. Imagine being a king of England, feared by many, vilified by Shakespeare, and then ending up under a £2 an hour parking space. Truly humbling. Eventually he was reburied in Leicester Cathedral with more dignity than he ever got in life. But still, not the posthumous glow-up he probably imagined, and Richard wasn't alone in the whole oops, we lost the king situation. Alfred the Great, the 9th century king of Wessex, had a similarly awkward fate. His bones were moved multiple times as churches got rebuilt, graves got shifted, and eventually nobody knew which pile of bones was his. In the 19th century, Victorian enthusiasts dug up a bunch of skeletons they thought might be Alfred. Spoiler, they weren't. To this day, nobody's entirely sure where Alfred actually ended up. For a man called the Great, that's a bit inconvenient. But let's crank the weird dial higher, because sometimes kings didn't just get misplaced. They got exhumed, pulled out on purpose. Take Charles I of England, beheaded in 1649 during the English Civil War. Buried quietly at Windsor, without much fanfare because the monarchy had just been cancelled. Fast forward to the 19th century. Prince Albert, husband of Queen Victoria, decided to renovate St. George's Chapel. Workers cracked open a vault and found Charles's coffin. Naturally, they peeked inside. According to reports, his head was still there, separated but recognizable, complete with flowing royal hair. The Victorians politely resealed him, but one can imagine the awkward silence. And then we have Louis XVI of France. Poor guy lost his head in 1793 thanks to the guillotine. His body and Marie Antoinette's were tossed into an unmarked grave at the Madeleine Cemetery in Paris. Years later, when the Bourbon monarchy made its big comeback, their remains were dug up and given a proper royal reburial in the Basilica of Saint-Denis. But let's be honest, after being dumped in a pit of lime and dirt, there wasn't much proper left to rebury. But if you want the strangest case, look no further than the Cadaver Synod. Yes, that's really what it's called. Rome, 897 AD. Pope Formosus had been dead for about 9 months. His successor, Pope Stephen VI, hated him so much that he had the corpse exhumed, dressed up in papal robes and put on trial. A literal courtroom, with the dead pope propped up in a chair. A deacon stood beside him to answer the charges. Needless to say, the verdict was guilty. The corpse was stripped of its robes, had a few fingers cut off, and was tossed into the Tiber River. Nothing says respect for the dead like dunking your predecessor's body like a soggy rag doll. Now, you might be saying, oh, okay, but that was a pope. Not a king. True, but it shows just how petty and theatrical medieval people could get with dead leaders. And kings weren't exempt. Plenty were dug up to check relics, move them to fancier tombs, or just satisfy the curiosity of future generations. Imagine spending your entire life fighting wars, marrying strategically, ruling an empire, only to become a curiosity exhibit for some nerdy antiquarians centuries later. So yeah, being royal didn't guarantee eternal peace. It guaranteed that your body would become a pawn in other people's politics, religion, or morbid fascination. Tombs that lied, marble effigies, and the mess inside. Hey guys, welcome back. You're still here, which either means you're a dedicated fan of weird history, or you've drifted into that half-asleep zone where my voice is just background static. Either way, let's keep floating. Tonight, we're sliding into the strange world of royal tombs. Those giant stone beds that made kings look eternal. So even while their actual bodies inside were busy doing the opposite of eternal. See, here's the thing about tombs. They were less about preserving the king and more about advertising his brand. The medieval PR machine. A king could die in a puddle of lamprey vomit, or burst like an overripe melon at his funeral. But once the tomb was finished, none of that mattered. Visitors weren't supposed to think of stench, gas, and bodily fluids. They were supposed to look at marble angels and Latin inscriptions and go, "Ah yes, eternal majesty. Take Henry VII of England." His actual corpse, embalmed in 1509, sealed up and by now probably dust with some stray fingernails. But the tomb? Oh, it's gorgeous. Gilded bronze effigies of Henry and his wife Elizabeth of York, lying serenely on top, like they're just taking a Sunday nap. The Tudor rows everywhere, saints watching from every angle. The whole setup screaming stability and dynastic glory. It's like the medieval version of photoshopping your Instagram selfies. Inside the box, decay. On top of the box, power and beauty. Or consider the French kings at Saint-Denis Basilica. Generations of monarchs were stuffed into that place, stacked like very expensive sardines. But each tomb was a work of art. Recumbent effigies, carved robes, delicate crowns. Some kings were shown in eternal prayer, hands folded like they'd never committed adultery or started a war. Others were shown holding swords, the stone equivalent of flexing your biceps. It was all very elegant, until you remembered that below the marble lid, it was just wood coffins, sometimes broken, sometimes leaking, and occasionally mixed up with other kings because records got sloppy. And here's where it gets deliciously ironic. Many effigies were designed to show kings and queens as youthful, serene, flawless. But some went the other way. Enter the transy tombs. These were double-decker tombs, popular in the late Middle Ages. On top you'd see a gorgeous sculpture of the king decked out in robes, face smooth and noble. But underneath, a second sculpture showing the same body as a decaying corpse, skin sagging, ribs poking out, worms crawling through. Because nothing says eternal glory like, "Here lies our beloved ruler currently rotting." One of the best examples is John Fitzalan, an English noble whose tomb shows him both alive and very, very dead. It's basically medieval honesty. Yes, he was powerful, but also, corpses don't age well. And yet, weirdly, people found this spiritual. It reminded visitors that death came for everyone, even kings. A nice touch of humility carved in stone. But most monarchs weren't into humility. They wanted monuments big enough to make peasants weep, and future kings jealous. The Habsburgs, of course, took this to another level. In Vienna, the imperial crypt houses over 140 royals in elaborate sarcophagi, some decorated with skulls, skeletons, and dramatic Baroque flourishes. But walk inside and you realize the coffins are just big ornate boxes. Some are cracked, some smell, some have leaked. In the 20th century, caretakers had to quietly fix coffins where fluid seeped out. Imagine being the guy hired to mop up Archduchess so-and-so, and yet visitors rarely think about the mess. They see the art, the Latin, the grand architecture. The illusion works. The tomb lies successfully. The king looks eternal, even while his corpse is as mortal as anyone else's. It's also worth noting how royals sometimes fought about where to be buried. Because naturally, why not keep the drama going after death? Some wanted to be in one cathedral, others in dynastic crypts, and a few split the difference by scattering their organs. You ended up with situations where the tomb said one thing, "Here lies the king," while the actual king was in 3 different places. So yes, Tombs were grand lies. Beautiful, serene lies carved in marble and bronze. The living admired them. The dead, of course, didn't care. They were busy becoming compost. Let's drift onward from the marble lies to the next chapter in this sleepy corpse saga. What happened when the living couldn't resist opening those tombs centuries later? Because kings weren't just buried once. They were rediscovered, dissected, and occasionally autopsied for fun. And honestly, the temptation to crack open these grand marble boxes was just too strong for later generations. You'd think people would respect the "Do Not Disturb" sign carved in Latin across the lid, but no. Curiosity is eternal. Kings might have built their tombs to project dignity forever, but the living couldn't resist taking a peek inside to see if there was anything juicy left. Sometimes it was monks or caretakers supposedly checking the condition of the relics. Sometimes it was ambitious scientists in the 18th or 19th centuries, armed with scalpels and an unhealthy fascination with dead royals. And sometimes it was just plain looters, hoping a king had been buried with a little too much gold. Spoiler, he usually hadn't. Royals were stingy in death too. One classic example is the tombs at Saint-Denis during the French Revolution. In 1793, revolutionaries stormed the basilica, cracked open centuries of royal coffins, and dumped the bones into mass graves. Louis XIV, Louis XV, Catherine de' Medici, all jumbled together like history's least appetizing stew. The tombs, though, were left behind, empty monuments to bodies that had been tossed out like yesterday's trash. Very symbolic, very French Revolution, and this wasn't even unusual. In England, archaeologists and antiquarians loved to pry into coffins. Sometimes they'd write polite little reports about what they found. Yes, the king's hair was still intact, but the face had shriveled rather alarmingly. Other times they'd quietly close the lid, realizing maybe this wasn't quite as dignified as they'd imagined. So the irony becomes almost poetic. Kings built monuments to hide the reality of their bodies. Later generations cracked them open to expose that reality again. Dust, bones, the occasional tuft of hair, not quite the eternal majesty the tombs promised. And that really was the strange fate of royal corpses. Not just to die, not just to decay, but to become curiosities for future centuries. A kind of second afterlife where kings didn't rule, but they did entertain. And if we zoom out for a moment, it almost feels like these tombs were less graves and more stages. A stage where kings performed their own propaganda long after the curtain had fallen. On the outside, marble angels, Latin eternal dignity. On the inside, wood-rot dust. But as long as nobody lifted the lid, the performance worked. And yet lids do get lifted. Because humans are nosy. Monarchs spent their lives trying to look immortal. And what did future generations do? They pried them open like an old jewelry box, just to see if the rumors about the embalming were true. Sometimes they even took notes like, the king's nose was perfectly preserved, or the queen's teeth were remarkably fine, which I guess is one way to honor the past, so the tombs, in the end, weren't permanent fortresses of memory. They were just temporary illusions. Beautiful shells, a reminder that no matter how much gold or marble you pile on top of yourself, eventually some curious monk, angry revolutionary, or overeager scientist will come along and poke at your remains like it's a history project. And that's where we'll drift next, into the stories of the kings who couldn't even stay peacefully dead. The ones who got dug up, unwrapped, measured, sketched, and in some cases treated like museum exhibits. Because apparently death was not the end of royal duty. Coffins reopened, kings examined, and the second afterlife, hey guys. Welcome back. If you're still awake, impressive. If you're half asleep, even better. Because this next bit of our sleepy stroll is all about kings who couldn't even rest in peace. See, You'd think after all the embalming, the tomb building, the prayers, and the expensive ceremonies, a king could just stay buried, quiet, untouched, but no. The reality is that royal corpses had a way of being disturbed, rediscovered, and even put on display. Almost like history's way of saying, "Sorry, buddy, you're not done entertaining us yet." Let's start with one of the most famous reopenings, Henry VIII. Yes, our favorite angry Tudor who collected wives like Pokemon cards. When Henry died in 1547, his body was placed in St. George's Chapel at Windsor, in a vault that was supposed to be temporary until a grand tomb could be built. Spoiler, the tomb was never built. So he ended up in a sort of makeshift grave with a couple of others, including Jane Seymour, his third wife. Over time, the vault was opened multiple times, and in the 19th century, curious Victorians peeked inside. They found a jumble of coffins, damaged and broken, Henry's among them. Imagine being remembered as one of the most powerful kings of England, only for your coffin to end up looking like it had been shoved into a storage closet. Then there's Charles I, the one who lost his head. We touched on him earlier, but it's worth slowing down. When workers at Windsor opened his coffin in 1813, they actually examined his remains in detail. They noted the decapitated head, the long flowing hair, even the shape of the nose. One observer wrote about gently holding the king's severed head, which, you have to admit, is not the most respectful way to spend a Tuesday afternoon. Still, they were very proud of themselves for proving it was indeed Charles. And then there's Napoleon Bonaparte. Not technically a king, but close enough in the giant ego and expensive funeral department. After his death in exile on St. Helena in 1821, Napoleon was buried in a simple grave, but in 1840 the French decided they wanted him back. His body was exhumed, and to everyone's shock it was remarkably well preserved, and almost eerily so. His hair, face, even his hands were still recognizable. Of course, this led to conspiracy theories that the British had poisoned him with arsenic, which had conveniently helped preserve the body. Either way, Napoleon got shipped back to Paris, where his new tomb was so over the top it looked like a luxury jewelry store. Eternal glory achieved, but only after being dug up and hauled halfway across the world. And then we have the most tragic, oddly theatrical example, the French royal family during the Revolution. Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette were dumped in a common grave in 1793. No markers, no dignity, just lime and dirt. Years later, when the monarchy was restored, their remains were supposedly recovered and reburied at Saint-Denis. But remains is a generous word. By the time they were dug up, there wasn't much left except fragments. Still, the restored Bourbons acted like it was a great homecoming, even though the bodies were essentially historical leftovers. Meanwhile, in Vienna, the Habsburg crypt has had its own share of disturbances. Coffins cracked, leaking fluids, and occasional inspections to check on the state of the emperors and empresses. Even the mighty Maria Theresa, Empress of Austria, hasn't been entirely left in peace. At one point, caretakers had to discreetly repair her coffin when time and decay took their toll. Imagine being one of the most powerful women in Europe, and centuries later, someone is patching up your coffin with modern tools like it's a home improvement project, and it's not just big names. Plenty of minor royals got dug up for science. In the 19th and 20th centuries, anthropology was obsessed with skulls, measuring them, categorizing them, comparing them, which meant royal tombs were prime targets. Dig up a duke, measure his skull, take a few notes about jaw structure, and then maybe put him back. Monarchs who once commanded armies ended up being reduced to data points in a scientist's notebook. The irony is delicious. Kings spent their lives trying to prove they were special, chosen by God, practically divine, and then in death they were poked, prodded, measured, and written up in a dusty report as Caucasoid male, cranial index slightly above average, Immortality, but not the flattering kind. So yeah, death wasn't the end for royal bodies. It was the start of a second, stranger life, part curiosity cabinet, part political symbol, part science experiment. And as we drift further, we'll get into one last layer of this strange tale, how even the myth of immortality got tangled into royal burials. Because some monarchs weren't just disturbed, they were practically turned into relic saints, or symbols that outlived their bones entirely. And here's the strange twist. Not every royal body was dug up for science or politics. Some were disturbed because people thought they were, well, holy, or at least useful. Kings and queens who had been especially pious in life often had their remains treated like relics. Instead of leaving them in peace, church officials or later monarchs broke them up into bits and distributed them like sacred souvenirs. Take St. Louis IX of France. We mentioned earlier how his bones were boiled after his death on crusade so they could be shipped home. But once they got to France, those bones didn't just rest quietly. They became holy relics, displayed in reliquaries, sometimes paraded around in processions. His body, instead of being allowed to vanish into dust, was turned into a permanent PR campaign for the French monarchy. Every time someone kissed a relic of Louis IX, it wasn't just about faith. It was also a reminder that the French royal line had a saint on speed dial, and he wasn't the only one. In Eastern Europe, several rulers became holy in death, and their tombs turned into pilgrimage sites. People would chip off little fragments of coffins, hair, or even bones, hoping to carry home a piece of royal blessing. Imagine spending your life worrying about dynasties and taxes, only to end up being literally whittled down into pocket-sized chunks for pilgrims. But even when kings weren't canonized, the myth of their immortality stuck around. Sometimes legends grew that a ruler hadn't actually died at all. Think Frederick Barbarossa in Germany. People claimed he was just sleeping inside a mountain, waiting to return when his people needed him. Spoiler: he had in fact drowned in a river on crusade, which is a lot less majestic. Still, the myth was powerful enough that his actual grave became almost secondary to the idea of him as an eternal figure. So between relics, legends, and the occasional conspiracy theory, royal bodies never really belonged to themselves. They belonged to the living, to the church, to the state, to the people who needed their memory to mean something. The body might rot, the tomb might crack, but the symbol lived on. And that's maybe the strangest afterlife of all. Not exploding coffins or leaking sarcophagi, but the fact that a dead king could still be useful centuries later. Useful as a relic, useful as a political tool, useful as a story whispered to sleepy listeners who by now might be drifting off themselves. And sometimes the irony was almost comical. A king who had spent his life hoarding treasures and building castles could after death become a tiny fragment in someone's pocket shrine. His grand marble tomb might be forgotten, but a sliver of his rib could be carried across continents as a sacred relic. It was the ultimate downgrade, or upgrade depending on how you look at it, and the myths, so they stuck around. Kings who were weak in life became mighty in legend. The sickly child monarch suddenly transformed into a sleeping hero in the mountains, waiting to return. The paranoid tyrant was recast as a saintly protector. History has a funny way of smoothing out the wrinkles when it suits the story, but if you peel back all the layers, you're left with something oddly human. The body of a king, whether rotting in a cracked coffin, boiled and divided up, or reimagined as eternal, still reminded everyone of the same truth. Even the highest crown couldn't escape the awkward, messy realities of death. And that's where these stories blur. Between relic and rumor, between history and legend, between the king who was buried and the king who somehow never stopped being useful. Relics, saints, and the recycling of royal bodies. Kings were supposed to be untouchable in life, majestic, anointed, chosen by God, wrapped in silk and gold. But after death, suddenly everyone wanted a piece of them, literally. And if you were really unlucky or really lucky, depending on your faith, you might find your bones chopped up and shipped out like luxury collectibles. One of the clearest examples comes from Saint Louis IX of France. We touched on him earlier, but he deserves a proper naptime detour. After he died of dysentery on crusade, his body was boiled so the bones could be transported home without, the smell. But once back in France, the bones didn't just rest in peace. They were parceled out as relics. A tooth here, a rib there, maybe a bit of finger if you were important enough to receive one. Imagine being the most powerful man in Christendom, only to end up like a spiritual jigsaw puzzle scattered across Europe. And Louis wasn't alone in this. Monarchs who leaned heavily into piety often found themselves treated as semi-divine after death. In some cases, their tombs became pilgrimage sites where visitors prayed, touched the stone, or in moments of overenthusiasm, chipped off a corner of the coffin to take home. Yes, kings turned into souvenirs, which is probably not what they envisioned when they spent their last breaths fretting about succession or military campaigns. But relic culture wasn't just about holiness. It was also political currency. If a cathedral possessed the shin bone of a sainted king, it suddenly gained status. Pilgrims brought money. Towns grew richer, churches grew more powerful. And in this weird economy of bones, royal corpses were premium stock. The church could hold up a bit of a king and say, look, divine approval of monarchy itself. Pay your respects and your offerings. Some kings even planned for this. They leaned into sainthood while still alive, hoping that their corpses would become spiritual assets after death. Others had no such intention, but hey, the people and priests decided for them. And so their eternal rest was interrupted by chisels, boiling cauldrons, and reliquaries shaped like golden arms or jeweled skulls. Meanwhile, ordinary royals who didn't qualify as saints sometimes had their bodies recycled in different ways. Their burial sites became political theaters. Think of Richard the Lionheart. His heart, his brain, and his body were buried in 3 separate places, because apparently one grave wasn't dramatic enough. His heart got its own shrine at Rouen, like a medieval celebrities fan club memorial. And yes, people came to see it, centuries later, even though the embalming had left it looking more like dusty parchment than anything resembling a human organ. Still, the symbolism mattered more than the smell. What's fascinating is how elastic royal death could be. Some bodies were locked away in marble tombs, sealed forever. Others were diced into relics, distributed like holy currency. Some were displayed, worshipped, prayed over, and some were forgotten in dusty corners until curious archaeologists cracked them open centuries later. There was no single royal afterlife. It depended on politics, piety, and sometimes just plain superstition. And of course, relics could spark rivalries. If one town had the jawbone of a sainted king, another town might try to claim the rib. Pilgrims would compare, argue, and occasionally accuse each other of fraud. Which means that even in death, monarchs could still cause political drama. Imagine being reduced to a disputed femur in someone else's argument about prestige. But in a way, this endless recycling of royal bodies says something deeper. It shows how desperately medieval society wanted to keep their kings around, even after decay, even after centuries. The man might die, the body might rot, but the symbol lived on. Bones, relics, hearts, and even dusty coffins all became tools to keep the story of monarchy alive. And it worked. People didn't remember the bloated corpses or the embarrassing embalming failures. They remembered the relics, the shrines, the myths. A king could be entirely gone, yet still more present than ever, glowing from behind a reliquary glass case while pilgrims whispered prayers. So yeah, rest in peace was rarely an option. For kings, death was just another performance, sometimes more enduring than their reign itself. And speaking of suspiciously fresh, that became its own obsession. Medieval people loved the idea of an incorruptible body, a corpse that didn't decay like everyone else's. If a king or queen's body looked strangely well preserved, it was seen as divine approval. Forget the fact that maybe the tomb was just unusually dry, or that they used a bit too much resin in the embalming. No, to contemporaries it meant sainthood. Some monarchs even leaned into this myth in advance. Collaborate embalming methods weren't just about hygiene, they were about legacy. If your corpse looked perfect when it was opened centuries later, well, that was proof you'd been special. It was medieval image management, but for eternity. Of course, incorruptibility wasn't always so flattering. Sometimes bodies that were supposed to be pristine turned out to be not. A jawbone slipping off, a crown sinking into the skull, a stomach that had clearly exploded long ago. Yet somehow even these less than dignified remains were repurposed into relics. A king's dried liver might be bottled up, or his desiccated heart placed in a silver urn, because apparently even royal organs deserved a career after death. One of the strangest cases was King Richard the Lionheart. His heart, as I mentioned, was embalmed and buried separately from his body. When it was rediscovered in the 19th century, scientists tested it and found traces of frankincense, myrtle, mint, and even mercury. Basically, his heart had been turned into a kind of medieval potpourri. Did it work? Not really. It crumbled to dust when handled, but at the time it was meant to symbolize eternal piety, a king's heart purified for heaven. And then there were kings whose blood was kept. Not all of it, of course, just a vial here or there. Sometimes during execution, sometimes after embalming, people collected it and treated it like relics. Bottled blood, royal hearts, saintly bones. Kings were never just buried. They were recycled, transformed, repackaged as symbols, which brings us to a strange conclusion. Royal death wasn't really about the dead. It was about the living, about the priests who wanted relics, about the rulers who wanted legitimacy, about the pilgrims who wanted miracles. Kings might have imagined themselves resting forever in marble silence, but history had other plans. And the thing is, once a royal body was chopped up or bottled, it gained a strange second life. Relics didn't just sit quietly in churches. They traveled. Pieces of kings crossed borders, were gifted to foreign rulers, or were paraded through cities like VIP guests. In some cases, a monarch who'd been deeply unpopular in life suddenly became beloved, once he was reduced to bone dust inside a golden reliquary. Death had a way of rewriting reputations, but not all relic stories were so polished. Sometimes they veered into the downright awkward. Take the heart of Anne of Brittany, twice Queen of France. Her embalmed heart was placed in an ornate golden reliquary, because why wouldn't it be? Centuries later, during the French Revolution, that heart was tossed into a melting pot along with church treasures. Romantic? Not really. In the end, even royal organs could be downgraded to scrap metal. And then there were the kings who didn't get to stay whole because of sheer logistics. Traveling monarchs often died far from home, which created a problem. You couldn't exactly drag a full royal corpse across mountains without consequences. So they'd be disassembled, flesh boiled off bones, organs buried on site, skeletons carted back to the capital. The result? One king, 3 or 4 burial sites, depending on how messy the journey was. To us that sounds grisly. To them it was practical. And also symbolic. Every separate burial, a heart in one cathedral, a body in another, multiplied the number of holy sites connected to the monarchy. More relics, more shrines, more opportunities for worship and money. Even in pieces, kings stayed politically useful. So if you think about it, Royal corpses were kind of the ultimate recycling project. The flesh might vanish, the organs might shrivel, but the remains kept working. They prayed for the living. They legitimized dynasties. They funded cathedrals. In some ways, they had a busier career in death than they ever managed in life. Hearts in boxes, heads in cupboards, and the afterlives of kings. So we've floated through the basics of royal death, the embalming, the tombs, the relics. But now it's time to wander into the stranger corners, the moments when royal bodies didn't just sit quietly in their graves, but decided to have a second act. Some kings turned into relics, some were split into parts, and some just kept popping up centuries later in the oddest ways. Let's start with hearts. For some reason, medieval royals were obsessed with separating them. A full-body burial wasn't dramatic enough. The heart deserved its own shrine, its own ceremony, and sometimes its own political agenda. Take Richard the Lionheart. When he died in 1199, his body was buried at Fontevraud Abbey in France, but his heart was sent to Rouen Cathedral deep in the Duchy of Normandy. Why? Because Richard wanted to show love and loyalty to Normandy, the region that had given his family so much power. His heart became both a relic of piety and a PR stunt. Centuries later, when archaeologists opened the urn, they found the heart reduced to dust but carefully preserved with spices like frankincense, mint, and even mercury. Essentially, his heart had been turned into medieval potpourri, her king's final afterlife, sitting in a silver box crumbling slowly into perfumed dust. But Richard wasn't the only one with a travelling heart. Eleanor of Castile, Queen to Edward I of England, had her heart buried at Blackfriars in London separate from her body at Westminster. Henry I of England supposedly had his heart sent to Reading Abbey. Even Anne of Brittany had hers encased in a golden reliquary, richly decorated with fleur-de-lis like a jewel on display. But as we mentioned earlier, the French Revolution wasn't impressed with heart reliquaries. Most of them were melted down for the gold. Centuries of reverence undone in a few minutes with a furnace. Romantic endings were not guaranteed. And then, of course, there are the heads. Because if hearts got special treatment, heads were not far behind. The most famous case might be Henry IV of France. After his assassination in 1610, his embalmed body was laid in a royal tomb. But during the Revolution, his tomb was opened and chaos followed. His head went missing, only to reappear centuries later in someone's private collection. Yes, someone had been keeping the king's head in their attic, like a family heirloom. For decades, people debated whether the mummified head really was Henry's. Finally, in 2010, forensic tests confirmed it. The king's head had survived wars, revolutions, and amateur storage solutions, which honestly feels very on-brand for French history. Or take Oliver Cromwell, not a king but certainly treated like one in death. After his funeral in 1658, his embalmed body was placed in Westminster Abbey like a monarch. But when the monarchy was restored under Charles II, Cromwell's corpse was dug up, hanged and beheaded. His head was displayed on a spike for decades, until it eventually fell down, was collected, passed between private owners, and finally buried quietly in Cambridge in the 20th century. A very long, very awkward afterlife for a man who wanted to abolish monarchy altogether. Kings' remains didn't even need to be intact to cause trouble. Sometimes just the rumor of their survival was enough. Charles I of England, executed in 1649, had his body quietly buried in St. George's Chapel at Windsor. For years, people speculated about the location. When his tomb was opened in 1813, the body was found remarkably well preserved, with the head cleanly severed, but still wearing its delicate beard. Observers noted how peaceful he looked, almost as though he had just fallen asleep, a strange kind of dignity, even after such a violent end. And then there were the miracles. Some monarchs' tombs became places where people claimed cures, visions, or divine signs. Saint Stephen of Hungary, for example, was canonized, and his right hand, said the Holy Right Hand, became a relic preserved in a reliquary. Pilgrims still come to see it today, paraded on feast days through Budapest. So yes, one of Hungary's most sacred relics is literally a dried royal hand, still making appearances 1,000 years later. But relics weren't always treated with reverence. Sometimes they were hidden, stolen, or forgotten. During the upheavals of the French Revolution, many royal remains were thrown into mass graves, their bones mixed with strangers. When 19th century restorers tried to identify and rebury them, it was, let's say, not an exact science. Some monarchs were put back in grand tombs, but nobody could swear the bones were really theirs. In the end, even kings became anonymous dust. The irony is hard to miss. These were people who spent their lives building legacies, carving their names into marble, and commissioning portraits to make sure nobody forgot them. And yet, centuries later, their corpses were wandering, dismembered, or unidentifiable. The crown might have been eternal, but the body was not. And still, the fascination never ends. Every time archaeologists announce a royal discovery, a heart in a casket, a skeleton under a cathedral floor, a severed head in a dusty box, the world stops to look. Royals may lose power, kingdoms may vanish, but their bodies keep resurfacing, demanding one last performance. So if kings imagined themselves resting in eternal dignity, they were sorely mistaken. Death wasn't an ending. It was just a new chapter in the strange, awkward, sometimes hilarious afterlives of monarchs. And since we're already knee-deep in the royal leftovers aisle, let's add a few more curiosities to the shelf. One of the strangest relic tales belongs to Louis XVI of France. After his execution in 1793, a few brave or maybe just opportunistic onlookers collected bits of the king's blood. Some dipped cloths in it, others supposedly filled tiny vials. For years these relics floated around in private collections. One even turned up in a gourd, yes, an actual dried gourd, painted with revolutionary symbols, said to contain a handkerchief soaked in the king's blood. DNA tests in the 21st century confirmed it matched the Bourbon line, which means, yes, someone's family heirloom for generations really was a king's bloody tissue. Nothing says grandma's keepsake quite like that. Then there's Alexander the Great, whose body became one of antiquity's greatest mysteries. After his death in Babylon in 323 BCE, his corpse was supposedly placed in a golden sarcophagus and paraded across the empire. It ended up in Alexandria, where it drew visitors for centuries. Julius Caesar supposedly visited the tomb. So did Caligula, who, because of course he did, allegedly stole Alexander's breastplate. But then, at some point, the tomb vanished. Nobody knows where Alexander's body went. For a man obsessed with conquering the world, disappearing completely might be the most ironic ending possible. And sometimes, monarchs didn't just lose control of their own bodies. Their entire graves became tourist attractions. Napoleon's tomb at Les Invalides in Paris is one of the most visited sites in the city, his massive sarcophagus surrounded by glory. But for decades after his death, there were disputes about whether the French had the real body or whether the British had secretly swapped it during transport from St. Helena. Conspiracy theories about royal corpses, just another layer to the afterlife. All these stories underline one strange truth. Royal death didn't really belong to the royals. Their bodies were political property, cultural property, even tourist property. The king might die, the queen might crumble, but their remains became artifacts, passed around, analyzed, prayed to, or displayed. So when we ask, what happened to kings' bodies after they died? The honest answer is just about everything. They were boiled, embalmed, split apart, stolen, melted down, worshipped, hidden, and rediscovered. They were relics, symbols, science experiments, and occasionally just forgotten bones in a dusty vault. And maybe that's the most fitting end for monarchy itself. Not a clean line, not eternal dignity, but endless recycling. Flesh turned to dust, dust turned to myth, myth turned back into flesh again whenever a coffin cracks open. An eternal performance, where the body of a king is never quite allowed to leave the stage. Dust, myth, and the long sleep of kings. So here we are at the quieter end of the story. We've followed royal bodies from their deathbeds to their coffins, from embalming tables to reliquaries, from shrines to mass graves. And what's left to say, really, except the obvious? Kings never really got to rest. In theory, a royal death was supposed to be the great equalizer. All men are mortal, all flesh decays, all crowns eventually slip off. But in practice, monarchs found themselves caught in an endless performance. Their corpses became symbols, their bones became relics, their hearts were bottled, their blood preserved, and their tombs, instead of being places of rest, turned into stages where new dramas played out. There's something almost tragic about it, but also a little funny. Picture a king who spent his entire life micromanaging etiquette, enforcing bowing angles at court, and stressing over portraits that made him look dignified. And then picture him centuries later as a half-disintegrated skeleton being poked by scientists in lab coats. The man who once demanded silence in the throne room is now providing content for archaeology documentaries. Royal dignity is a fragile thing, and yet maybe this was the point all along. Monarchs weren't supposed to disappear like ordinary people. They were supposed to linger, to outlast their bodies, to be talked about long after their coffins cracked and their embalming failed. Even when they were reduced to bone dust, they still managed to matter, as relics, as symbols, as stories. Think of the irony. The peasant buried in a village churchyard could vanish completely. No name, no record, no trace. But the king, even when his head was stolen, or his heart crumbled, or his bones got jumbled in a mass grave, he still mattered. He was still searched for, argued over, rediscovered, and retold. Death erased his body, but made his myth immortal. And if you squint a little, that's the real legacy of monarchy. Not the crowns, not the battles, not the endless line of inbred cousins marrying each other. It's the fact that centuries later, people are still opening coffins, still writing about embalmed hearts, still arguing about whose skull is whose. Kings got exactly what they wanted, to be remembered. Just maybe not in the way they expected. So the next time you see an elaborate royal tomb, remember what's inside. Not just a body, but a long history of human curiosity, myth-making, and a fair bit of awkward decomposition. The marble angels may look serene, but down below the king is probably doing his best impression of a collapsing linen sack. And with that, we can finally let the kings rest. Or at least pretend to, because if history has taught us anything, it's that sooner or later, someone will come along with a crowbar, a notebook, or a DNA swab, ready to disturb their eternal sleep all over again. So, sweet dreams, royal corpses, you've earned them, even if we won't let you keep them. And of course, the story doesn't really stop in the Middle Ages or with the French Revolution. Royal bodies keep popping up in the strangest places, sometimes centuries after anyone expected to see them again. Which brings us to one of the most famous modern examples, Richard III of England. Now, Richard had a rough reputation. Shakespeare painted him as a twisted villain, complete with a hunchback and a talent for murderous scheming. He died at the Battle of Bosworth in 1485, the last English king to fall in combat. Afterward, his body was buried without much ceremony in a friary at Leicester. And then the friary disappeared. Over the centuries, the memory of Richard's grave faded, replaced by streets, shops, and eventually, a parking lot. Guess one of England's most infamous kings spent over 500 years under asphalt, marked only by painted white lines for compact cars. In 2012, archaeologists finally dug him up, and to the surprise of many, the skeleton showed clear evidence of scoliosis, a curved spine. So Shakespeare hadn't completely made it up. The poor guy did have a crooked back. He also had battle wounds that matched the reports of his bloody end. For centuries, Richard had been caricatured as a deformed monster, and then there he was, tucked neatly under parking spot number 7. A king, reduced to a trivia question on a pub quiz. But Richard isn't the only one who resurfaced in odd ways. Tsar Nicholas II of Russia and his family, executed in 1918, were hastily buried in a forest by the Bolsheviks. For decades their remains were hidden, fueling rumors that Anastasia or other children had escaped. It wasn't until the 1990s that the graves were properly excavated and identified through DNA. Today, they rest in St. Petersburg, but the discovery re-sparked centuries of fascination with the tragic Romanovs. Once again, royal corpses refuse to fade quietly into history, and sometimes rediscovery takes on almost comedic tones. Take Frederick the Great of Prussia. He wanted to be buried next to his beloved dogs, but instead, his body was stuck in a series of different locations for political reasons. It wasn't until 1991, more than 2 centuries after his death, that he finally got his wish. After all the wars, regime changes, and arguments about his memory, Frederick was laid to rest beside his greyhounds. A royal afterlife, delayed but oddly wholesome. What all of this shows is that even in modern times, kings and queens can't seem to stay buried. The living keep digging them up, testing their DNA, arguing about their legacies, or moving them around to suit the politics of the moment. Death for royalty is not a full stop. That's just a comma. So let's float along to another king who just couldn't stay put, Napoleon Bonaparte. Now Napoleon probably imagined his legacy being carved in marble and remembered in glory. Instead, he ended up on St. Helena. After losing the Battle of Waterloo, he was shipped off to this isolated rock in the South Atlantic, where he lived out his days in exile. When he died in 1821, the British buried him there, under a simple tomb with no inscription, because they couldn't even agree on whether to write Emperor of the French or General Bonaparte. For nearly 20 years, Napoleon's body just rested under a plain slab, while goats wandered by. But in 1840, France finally decided that maybe it was time to bring him home. So they exhumed him, sailed him back in a dramatic procession, and reburied him under that enormous red-domed tomb in Paris that we see today at Les Invalides. The irony? They gave him one of the most extravagant burials in European history, after first letting him rot on a windswept island for 2 decades. Napoleon might have enjoyed the final pomp, but he probably would have preferred not dying in damp exile in the first place. And since we're on the subject of ancient royalty, who became modern celebrities, let's bring up the inevitable Tutankhamun. The boy king of ancient Egypt died around 1323 BCE, and for centuries no one really cared. His tomb was buried under rubble, forgotten by history, and he wasn't exactly one of the most powerful pharaohs anyway. But then in 1922, Howard Carter unearthed the tomb, and suddenly King Tut became the most famous mummy in the world. Tourists flocked. Newspapers ran breathless stories, and of course, the whole mummy's curse myth was born. In reality, the so-called curse was probably just mold infection and coincidence, but hey, archaeologists die from respiratory illness doesn't sell newspapers quite as well. Tutankhamun's afterlife was basically a PR makeover, from obscure, possibly sickly teenager to glittering icon of Egyptomania. He became a symbol of golden masks, curses, and endless documentaries, which, honestly, is probably better than being forgotten in a hole under the sand. Let's wander over to another case of misplaced monarchy, Charles I of England. He was executed in 1649 after losing the Civil War to Oliver Cromwell. His head was sewn back onto his body, yes, sewn, before burial in St. George's Chapel at Windsor. But when they opened his coffin in the 1800s, people were surprised to find the head still attached, perfectly preserved, complete with a little tuft of moustache. They also reported a faint smell of embalming spices, because apparently even in death, Charles still had better grooming than half of England's nobility. And then there's the Habsburgs, because of course there is. These people couldn't even get death right without a bizarre tradition attached. For centuries, members of the Habsburg dynasty had their bodies buried in one church, their hearts placed in urns in another church, and their intestines shoved into copper vessels in yet another location. Vienna literally became a scavenger hunt of royal organs. So if you ever wondered why the Habsburgs seemed so fragmented in life, just remember, they kept the same energy after death. Oh, and we can't forget Louis XVI of France. His burial was less glamorous than it sounds. In 1817, after being placed in the royal crypt at Saint-Denis, his coffin was later opened, and it turned out his body had been poorly embalmed. Visitors described the smell as unforgettable. Not quite the royal dignity one imagines, but then again, Louis had spent most of his life running from revolutions. So maybe his afterlife was just consistent with the chaos. Even in the 20th century, royal bodies were still being shuffled around like oversized chess pieces. For example, Haile Selassie of Ethiopia, revered as a near-divine figure by Rastafarians worldwide, died in 1975 under mysterious circumstances after being deposed. His body was hidden under a toilet in the imperial palace for years. Yes, under a bathroom floor. It wasn't until the 1990s that he was given a proper burial with state honors. From emperor to bathroom floor tile, history does have a dark sense of humor. And since we're already drifting through this bizarre graveyard tour, we absolutely have to stop at one of history's pettiest posthumous stories, Oliver Cromwell. Now, Cromwell wasn't a king, quite the opposite. He was the guy who executed Charles I and ruled as Lord Protector during England's brief experiment without monarchy. When he died in 1658, he got a proper state funeral, buried in Westminster Abbey like a king. But here's the catch. When Charles II returned to power just 2 years later, he wasn't exactly thrilled about the man who killed his dad, lying in the nation's holiest royal burial spot. So, what did Charles do? He had Cromwell's corpse dug up, hanged on a gibbet, and then decapitated. Yes, they literally gave him a trial after death and executed his body. His head was then stuck on a spike outside Westminster Hall, where it stayed for nearly 30 years. Eventually it fell down in a storm, was passed around by collectors for over 2 centuries, and finally ended up buried at Cambridge University in 1960. So if you think family feuds can't get petty, remember, the Stuarts dragged their enemy out of the grave just to make a point. Speaking of severed heads, another royal noggin had its own long adventure, Henri IV of France. He was assassinated in 1610, buried at Saint-Denis. And then during the French Revolution, his grave was looted. Somewhere along the way, his embalmed head went missing. For centuries, it floated around in private collections, occasionally popping up in auctions, until it was positively identified in 2010 by forensic experts. Imagine owning a king's head for generations, and not quite being sure whether it was authentic. Henry's skull spent more time being a conversation piece in someone's attic than ruling France. Then there's the strange saga of Mary, Queen of Scots. After being executed in 1587, her body was buried at Peterborough Cathedral. But in 1612, her son, now King James I of England, decided she deserved a more fitting resting place. So he moved her body to Westminster Abbey, right across from Elizabeth I, the very cousin who had ordered her execution. It's like being forced to share a dorm room in the afterlife with the person who got you killed. Cozy but awkward. And of course we can't skip Alexander the Great because his corpse became practically a political trophy. After his death in 323 BCE, his body was supposedly preserved in honey, which admittedly is one way to keep fresh. His generals fought over where he should be buried, because controlling Alexander's remains was basically a ticket to legitimacy. Eventually his body ended up in Alexandria, where it was visited by Julius Caesar, Augustus, and countless others. And then it disappeared. To this day, no one knows exactly where Alexander's tomb is. Thousands of years later, archaeologists are still chasing his ghost. For someone who conquered half the known world, he sure pulled off one of the best vanishing acts in history. And while we're on legendary vanishing acts, let's not forget Attila the Hun. According to legend, when Attila died in 453 CE, his body was placed in a triple coffin, one of gold, one of silver and one of iron, and buried in secret. The workers who dug the grave were supposedly killed to keep the location hidden. That's one way to guarantee privacy. No one has ever found the tomb, so Attila might still be lying somewhere under the Hungarian soil, wrapped up in folklore and conspiracy theories. But not every royal burial is mysterious. Some are just, well, disappointing. Take James VI and I, the same king who united England and Scotland. When his coffin was opened in the 19th century, the body was described as horribly decayed. The attendants were shocked by the smell and quickly sealed him up again. Not every rediscovery gets you a glittering golden mask like Tutankhamun. Sometimes you just get a whiff of centuries-old royal rot. So whether it's heads on spikes, bodies lost under parking lots, organs scattered around Europe, or missing tombs that spark endless treasure hunts, the pattern is the same. Kings, queens, emperors, and conquerors never really get to fade quietly. Death is supposed to level everyone, but history seems determined to drag royal corpses back into the spotlight, sometimes literally dragging them out of the ground. And since we're still wandering around the endless museum of dead monarchs, let's check in on another royal whose afterlife was just as messy as their reign, Catherine de' Medici. She died in 1589 in Blois, and was buried in a Parisian church beside her husband, Henry II. Except minor problem, during the French Revolution, mobs stormed the royal graves at Saint-Denis, yanked open coffins and dumped the bones into pits. Catherine, once the Queen Mother of France, architect of dynastic marriages, and alleged poisoner of enemies, ended up as just another skeleton tossed into a trench. No gilded coffin, no fancy mausoleum, just a jumbled pile with everyone else. Ironically democratic, if you think about it. The French Revolution had a knack for this, actually. It wasn't just Catherine. Almost the entire line of French kings got trashed. Louis XIV, the Sun King himself, who spent his life bathed in golden mirrors at Versailles, was reduced to bones thrown in a common grave. Imagine ruling France for 72 years, only to end up dumped into a hole by angry citizens who couldn't care less. History has a way of cutting people down to size. And speaking of kings cut down to size, let's glide back to Edward I of England, also called Longshanks. He died in 1307, and when his tomb was opened in the 18th century, his body was said to be almost perfectly preserved. The monks had apparently done a stellar job embalming him, because even after centuries, his features were still recognizable. Which sounds impressive, until you remember that recognizable in medieval embalming terms probably meant he looked like a wax candle that had been left on the windowsill too long. Now, some royal corpses became morbid tourist attractions. Pope Innocent X, for instance. He died in 1655, embalmed poorly, and his face collapsed almost instantly. When his body was displayed, the faithful came to see the Pope one last time, only to be greeted by what looked like a half-deflated balloon in papal robes. Not exactly the image of eternal dignity the Church probably wanted. Then there's Pedro Mauch of Brazil, who died in 1834. His body has been exhumed multiple times, once for a move, another time for scientific study, and at least once to settle family disputes. At one point when the coffin was opened, onlookers claimed his mustache was still intact, because apparently, even after a century, his facial hair game remained stronger than most people's alive today. But maybe the crown for most bizarre corpse journey still belongs to Charles V of Sweden. He was killed in battle in 1718, shot through the head. His body was taken back to Sweden and buried with full honors. But centuries later, his skull was exhumed and examined multiple times to figure out who exactly fired the fatal shot. Spoiler, they still don't know. But poor Charles's head has basically been passed around like a cold case file for historians. Death didn't give him peace. It just turned him into Sweden's longest-running murder mystery. And if we want to get truly strange, we can't skip the heart of Richard the Lionheart. Yes, just the heart. After his death in 1199, his body was buried in one place, his entrails in another, and his heart was interred at Rouen Cathedral. When scientists opened the urn in the 19th century, all that was left was dust. Tests later revealed traces of frankincense, possibly an attempt to mimic Christ's burial. Which is sweet, except it also means someone literally carried around the king's heart like a medieval perfume sachet. All of this paints a pretty consistent picture. Royalty didn't just live strangely. They also managed to die strangely. And centuries later, the living keep digging them up, poking, testing, arguing, and sometimes accidentally losing track of them entirely. In a way, kings and queens remain prisoners of their status, even in death. Ordinary people get forgotten. Royals get rediscovered, dissected, and put back on display. Eternal rest just isn't in the royal job description. The wandering dead of royalty. So here we are again, still tiptoeing around royal coffins, as if history is one giant, never-ending graveyard tour. And since we've already covered kings in pits, queens under parking lots, and emperors in honey jars, let's float toward a few more cases where royal afterlives got complicated. Let's start with Vlad the Impaler, the man who inspired Dracula. Now you'd think his tomb would be some massive tourist hotspot, glowing with Gothic candles and mystery. But no, Vlad's burial is actually one of history's great unsolved questions. Some sources say he was buried at a monastery in Snagov, Romania. Others argue his body was taken elsewhere. Archaeologists have dug up the supposed site multiple times, but they've either found nothing, or in one awkward case, just horse bones. Yes, horse bones. It seems even in death, Vlad the Impaler didn't feel like cooperating. The man terrified Europe in life, and in death he remains a ghost story with no real address. And then there's the tragic soap opera of Eva Perón, Argentina's beloved First Lady. Now, she wasn't a queen or a princess, but she got the kind of treatment only royalty usually receives. After her death in 1952, her body was embalmed with such precision that she looked more like a wax doll than a corpse. Which was fine, until politics got messy. In 1955, a military coup removed her husband Juan Perón from power, and suddenly Eva's corpse became a problem. The new rulers didn't want her embalmed body hanging around as a shrine for supporters, so they secretly shipped her remains to Italy, buried under a false name. For nearly 20 years, Eva's body was missing. while Argentinians whispered rumors like she was hidden in Europe or locked in a basement. In 1971, she was finally returned to Juan in Spain, and eventually in 1976, reburied in Buenos Aires in a heavily fortified tomb. To this day, her resting place is said to be one of the most secure in the world, because apparently even dead, Eva Perón was still too politically dangerous to be left unguarded. But wandering corpses aren't just a modern South American thing. Oh no, Europe kept the trend alive for centuries. Case in point, Pope Formosus. Now I know, not a king, but his story is too bizarre to leave out. He died in 896, but a year later his successor decided he didn't like him. So what did he do? He had Formosus's corpse dug up, dressed in papal robes, and put on trial in what became known as the Cadaver Synod. Yes, a literal corpse was propped up on a throne and accused of crimes. Shockingly, the corpse didn't defend itself very well. It was found guilty, stripped of its robes, and tossed into the Tiber River. Talk about not being allowed to rest in peace. And then we have Lenin again. Not technically royalty, but the Soviets sure embalmed him like one. After his death in 1924, Lenin's body was preserved and placed in a glass tomb in Red Square, where it remains on display to this day. Teams of specialists spend countless hours and rubles each year maintaining the illusion that he's peacefully napping, when in reality, his body has been pumped full of so many chemicals he's basically part science project, part wax museum. The irony is delicious. Lenin, who railed against Tsarist pomp and ceremony, became the closest thing to a secular saint in a giant mausoleum. He essentially replaced the Romanovs' sacred relics with his own. And people still line up to see him, even though he's more laboratory than human at this point. But since we brought up the Romanovs earlier, let's circle back. Remember how we mentioned Nicholas II and his family? Well, not all of their remains were found in the same spot. For years, some of the children's bodies were missing. That fueled endless speculation that maybe Anastasia or Alexei had escaped. It wasn't until the early 2000s that the missing remains were finally uncovered and identified by DNA testing. And even now, the Russian Orthodox Church has been hesitant to fully accept them, which means that more than a century after their deaths, the Romanovs are still stuck in limbo, half saints, half political pawns. Truly, even in death, that family couldn't catch a break. And speaking of unfinished business, let's check on Christopher Columbus. Again, not royal, but his body was treated with royal levels of chaos. He died in 1506 and was buried in Spain. But then his remains were moved to Hispaniola, then allegedly to Havana, and then back to Spain again. Today, Seville Cathedral claims to have his bones, but the Dominican Republic also claims to have him, which means either Columbus somehow duplicated himself, or one country is proudly displaying someone else's skeleton. Honestly, given his reputation, both options feel on brand. What all of this adds up to is a very simple truth. For powerful people, death is never the end. Their bodies become symbols, bargaining chips, relics, or sometimes just morbid curiosities. They're embalmed too much, buried too little, lost, stolen, or displayed. Ordinary people vanish into the soil, but kings, queens, emperors, and famous leaders, they just keep wandering, dragged back into the spotlight whether they want it or not. So the next time you're standing in a quiet cemetery, staring at neat little rows of headstones, remember this. The real chaos isn't in the living, it's in the dead, especially the royal ones. And since we've already brought up Lenin's wax museum situation, it feels only fair to drift over to another celebrity corpse of the 20th century, Rasputin. Now, technically, he wasn't royal, but he was so tangled up with the last Romanovs that his death became part of their legend. After being murdered in 1916, poisoned, shot, and eventually drowned, depending on which account you like best, His body was buried outside St. Petersburg, but in 1917, when the revolution broke out, officials dug him up, hauled the body into the open and burned it. Supposedly, as the fire consumed him, his body sat up in the flames, which really didn't help calm anyone's nerves. Science says it was just muscle contractions, but the crowd saw a demonic wizard rising from his own pyre. Honestly, Rasputin wouldn't have wanted it any other way. And if Rasputin had one of the most theatrical post-death performances, Catherine the Great had one of the strangest post-death rumors. She died in 1796 of a stroke, but thanks to gossip, a bizarre myth spread that she'd been killed by, shall we say, an unusual accident involving a horse, which was absolutely not true. But it stuck, because people love scandal more than medical fact. Catherine was actually buried with full honors in St. Petersburg. But centuries later, when the Soviets moved royal bodies around, her tomb was neglected, cracked, and in need of repair. So even the most powerful empress in Russian history wasn't spared a shabby afterlife. Instead of immortal glory, she got centuries of bad jokes and a broken sarcophagus. But if we're talking broken sarcophagi, we have to float over to Pope Pius X, who died in 1958. The embalming job was so catastrophically bad that his body literally decomposed on display. Witnesses said his nose fell off, his face turned green, and his body swelled until the coffin lid didn't fit. Imagine being Pope for nearly 20 years, only for your funeral to turn into a biology lesson in what not to do with a corpse. Some attendees even fainted from the smell. Truly, death does not care about dignity. Royal embalming disasters are almost their own genre. In the 19th century, Queen Victoria left strict instructions about her burial. She wanted mementos packed into her coffin, including jewelry, a plaster cast of her late husband Albert's hand, and even a lock of hair from her former servant John Brown. But despite all the sentimental items, the embalming wasn't exactly flawless. By the time she was finally sealed away in 1901, attendants quietly admitted she looked less like the stern matriarch of empire and more like someone halfway through Halloween makeup. Still, the public never saw her, so the legend of Victoria the Eternal Grandmother remained untarnished. And let's not forget Ferdinand of Bulgaria. When he died in exile in Germany in 1948, he was embalmed poorly. So poorly, in fact, that by the time his remains were moved decades later, they had mostly liquefied inside the coffin, which just goes to show even kings can end up as puddles. A whole empire behind you, and you still melt like an ice cream cone in summer. What all these stories really underline is that royalty spends their lives trying to control how they're seen. Grand portraits, marble statues, endless ceremonies. But once they're gone, the bodies stop cooperating. They bloat, they vanish, they burn, they melt, they get misplaced, and sometimes they come back centuries later in the hands of some very excited archaeologist. Death laughs in the face of legacy. And since we're already on the theme of royal bodies that just would not cooperate, let's float over to Philip II of Spain. The man who ruled over the world's first truly global empire died in 1598. You'd think his body would have been handled with absolute precision. Instead, his funeral preparations were so painfully slow that, by the time they finally got him ready for burial, the royal attendants were apparently gagging from the smell. Philip was carted through Madrid in a procession that looked glorious on the outside. But if you were standing close enough, it was probably more odor-rotting emperor than divine majesty. Then there's Charles II of Spain, sometimes called the Bewitched. You already know the guy had one of the most catastrophic genetic legacies of inbreeding in European history. His autopsy in 1700 revealed that his body was, to put it mildly, a medical disaster. According to reports, his intestines were rotten, his lungs filled with water, and his head was full of water too.